An official inquiry into abuse at the Winterbourne private hospital near Bristol has called for fundamental changes in the way vulnerable adults are looked after. 11 former staff members have admitted neglecting and ill-treating patients with learning difficulties. The serious case review says the hospital's owners put profit before standards. Alison Holt reports.
Behind the locked doors of Winterbourne View, a hospital for people with learning disabilities. The hidden BBC panorama camera revealed what today's serious case review called the arbitrary violence against vulnerable patients. It describes a place where restraint was commonplace. Steve Sollers was shocked when he discovered the number of times his son was restrained. He's asked us not to show Sam's photo.
45 times in the space of a 5-month period. It's not right. Considering that he's been at the new place, well, I would say he's been there 2 years now. In 2 years, I think they've restrained him twice.
The report says Castlebeck, the company that ran Winterbourne View, took financial rewards without real accountability. Staff were undertrained and not properly supervised.
We cannot put people together in hospitals and leave them without any credible monitoring and the naive belief that this hospital can deliver both assessment and treatment.
And there were warnings. The report details nearly 40 safeguarding alerts. The council, the police and the regulator, the Care Quality Commission, were also told of problems. Little was done.
I would like to take this opportunity today to convey our deep regret for the events that took place at Winterbourne View Private Hospital. In particular, I would like to express our profound regret to the hospital's patients and to their families, friends and carers.
In a statement, Castlebeck says it has made significant changes to ensure there can't be a repeat of Winterbourne View. Terry Bryan is the nurse who blew the whistle on what was happening at the hospital. He now acts as an independent inspector, but says this sort of abuse remains difficult to detect.
People can hurt people. People can hurt people if they want to. And if they want to, they will, because they'll do it behind a closed door when no one's looking. No CQC inspection is going to pick that up. No police investigation is going to pick that up. The only people who are going to pick that up are going to be the people in that room or on shift who know who's in that room.
Winterbourne View was closed down more than a year ago, but for many it leaves the question of how such a place, which was large, locked and cut off from the community, could ever have been the right place for people with learning disabilities. Alison Holt, BBC News, South Gloucestershire.
Well, Anne Milton is Minister for Public Health. She joins me now from Westminster. Good afternoon. It's a highly critical report that's been published today. How do you ensure that there is never again a repeat of the abuse that we saw at Winterbourne?
Well, I think what this report clearly demonstrates is this was a failure at every level, you know, a serious, shocking, appalling abuse which has led to criminal proceedings, but also a failure at ward level, insufficient management, a failure of other services to pick up the early warning signs of what was going on, and also a complete failure on the commissioners, those people that were paying for the care in this home, clearly not having any sort of monitoring in place. As your piece rightly pointed out, you know, it's quite tricky to, even with unannounced inspections, to always be sure about what's going on. So you need action at every single level. This is a real shock and a real wake-up call.
But what exactly will you do then? What action can be taken to make sure it isn't repeated?
There are a number of actions. I think on a sort of one-to-one basis, those we're bringing in minimum training standards. It's about leadership at ward level, and we need to work with the commissioners to make sure they are very clear about their duties and responsibilities. When they're paying for care, they should be paying for high quality care. Of course, there are wider issues about why other agencies didn't pick up the early warning signs. And of course, there are issues around restraint. The gentleman interviewed talked about how little restraint had been used since his relative had moved on, and we need to look at that. So it's action at every single level. This is really shocking. It's very, very distressing for those involved, and we are determined to make sure this never happens again.
Anne Milton, thank you very much for joining us.
First this lunchtime, a damning report into the catalogue of abuse at the Winterbourne View private hospital has been published this morning. It was first exposed by the BBC's Panorama programme, who secretly filmed in the hospital that treated vulnerable adults. It has since been closed. Our health correspondent Matthew Hill has been at the press conference.
Well, this report is all about institutional failure, not only of Castlebeck, the private company that owned Winterbourne View, but also those organisations charged with safeguarding the rights of these very vulnerable individuals. We learned that there was poor training of staff, the techniques in restraint that they were taught were probably dangerous. Patients were put behind the rights of Castlebeck to earn money. They were taking £3,500 for each patient per week, and yet they weren't even prepared to tell the chair of the inquiry how they were spending that money. The NHS was writing a blank cheque, if you like, and were not checking up that there were safeguards in place in terms of quality of care. Now, since 2008, we had a series of up to 40 safeguarding incidents raised with South Gloucestershire Council. I put it to the chair of that committee, why didn't he see this pattern?
The organisations, and including the council, became locked into considering each individual event as a single event. I think there are a number of reasons behind that. Certainly, one is that most of those referrals actually came from the hospital itself. There was a sense that we were working with an open, transparent, collegiate group of managers at Winterbourne View Hospital. That trust was entirely misplaced, and critically, I think there was a lack of challenge in the system.
Well, the sort of recommendations we've seen are sort of banning certain restraint techniques, involving the families much more with the care of their loved ones. But we haven't seen any particular organisation singled out as being that which should be in charge overall of safety. But we may hear more on that in the autumn when there's a report from the Department of Health.
And a report published today into the abuse of vulnerable adults at a hospital near Bristol has strongly criticised its owners, health professionals and the police.
Well, our health correspondent Rebecca Broxton joins us now. Rebecca, who is ultimately responsible for what happened?
Well, ultimately, it is those who carried out the abuse that are responsible for their actions. But the report today did say that Castlebeck, the former owners of Winterbourne View, were accountable for what happened there, putting money before care. But the report exposed failings by NHS regulators, failings by NHS commissioners, failings by the local authority and failings by the police.
It was these 11 so-called carers who meted out the abuse at Winterbourne View. But in the aftermath of the exposure of their crimes, questions as to how it could happen were ultimately raised. This morning, the serious case review into the role of the agencies involved in the care of the patients there was published.
I think it makes very troubling reading, and I think it will make it very clear that institutional abuse is complicated, devastating for the people who are subject to it, and incredibly difficult to spot, most particularly when information about incidents is edited or even falsified.
In her report, Dr. Flynn found there was institutional abuse. The hospital was supposed to assess, treat and rehabilitate patients. It failed to do so. NHS commissioners failed to monitor placements or be aware of events. Patients and their families' views weren't acted upon. And the agencies failed to collaborate to identify the pattern of abuse. South Gloucestershire Council was in charge of safeguarding patients at Winterbourne View. It admits families' concerns weren't taken seriously enough.
And one of the key components of Winterbourne View Hospital was a failure to listen. They were heard, but they weren't listened to.
There's no doubt information did come to our care coordinators, and it wasn't necessarily acted upon in an appropriate way.
It was also revealed today that over 3.5 years, 9 allegations of abuse against patients were reported to Avon and Somerset police, yet they failed to notice the pattern of abuse.
We could have done things differently, but when we've looked very closely at the actions those officers have taken, quite often they've explored every opportunity to pursue investigations. What we didn't do necessarily is recognise that there were a series of incidents and a pattern that was well hidden from us.
No one should have to endure the kind of abuse meted out at Winterbourne View. Those criticised in this report today all admit they failed patients and their families. The challenge now is to try to ensure that it never happens again.
What I can guarantee is that the Care Quality Commission will continually review and improve its processes to ensure that as far as we possibly can, the public can be assured that their relatives, their sons, their daughters are protected from unacceptable and, in this case, criminal activity.
Amanda Sherlock from the Care Quality Commission. So, Rebecca, what changes could we see as a result of this report?
Well, there are hundreds of recommendations contained within the report. One of the main ones being that people with learning disabilities are cared for closer to home in their local communities. All the agencies involved are now reviewing their procedures, and the government is due to report its review into what happened at Winterbourne View later this autumn. Paul Burstow has told us that will include an action plan for improvements and for change.
OK, Rebecca Broxton, thank you.
Well, two charities have today warned that there could be other scandals like the one at Winterbourne View. MENCAP and the Challenging Behaviour Foundation say they've received more than 250 complaints of similar abuse elsewhere. Let's talk to the author of that report, Beverly Dawkins, who joins us from our Westminster studio. Firstly, how widespread do you think this is?
We're very concerned that these are widespread problems. It took secret cameras to show the extent of the abuse that we witnessed at Winterbourne, but the reports from families, the case studies in our report, the findings of the CQC all indicate these are system-wide failures.
And for families of people in those hospitals where abuse may be going on, what comfort can you offer them tonight?
Well, it's really important that they report those concerns and alert safeguarding teams to them. We hope that one of the things that will come out of all of the reports that have been issued today is that we'll be better able to safeguard people in units of that kind. But at the end of the day, most of the people in our report certainly didn't need to be in those units. And what we're campaigning for is for the development of much better local services so that people can stay closer to their families, where they're better able to support and to protect them.
So what action do you want to see the government take now?
We want the government to take leadership and start closing down units like Winterbourne View that are far too large, far too far away from home, and invest in the local services that will give people the support they need right from the start so they don't end up in places like that in the first place.
And do you think we'll do anything about this phrase, profitability before care? Because that's extremely worrying.
It is extremely worrying. People have talked to us about, the economies of scale, but actually the cost of good quality support is much cheaper locally. We know that people are living in services that are local and much, much cheaper than the £3,500 a week that it costs to go to Winterbourne View.
OK, Beverly Dawkins from MENCAP, thank you very much indeed.
It was worse than we thought. The report into the Winterbourne View scandal uncovers the missed chances to save the patients from abuse. Good evening. Residents who endured abuse at the Winterbourne View Hospital were let down by social services, the NHS and the police. They all failed to see what was going on and didn't take steps to protect some of the most vulnerable people in society.
That was the finding today in the long-awaited official report into the scandal, which was uncovered by the BBC. And it turns out to be even worse than first thought. The report says there were dozens of incidents of restraint and assaults on patients at the hospital near Bristol.
Money was put above care and trust was misplaced, with public officials not checking up on the service being provided. Here's our health correspondent, Matthew Hill.
They were denied access to their families, restrained using painful techniques.
Because you know what will happen?
Time and again, vulnerable adults were abused. The authorities didn't believe the patients, trusting instead the managers of this private hospital.
We often use the metaphor of the tip of an iceberg, and that's very apt in relation to Winterbourne View.
The author of today's report says the owners, Castlebeck, took financial reward without the responsibility, relying too heavily on poorly paid and untrained staff. It seems the NHS never asked what it was getting for the £3,500 a week it was paying for each patient. The local council were alerted to concerns about the welfare of patients 40 times. So why did no one spot a pattern?
There was a sense that we were working with an open, transparent, collegiate group of managers at Winterbourne View Hospital. That trust was entirely misplaced.
Do you accept personal responsibility? You sacked 2 middle managers. Do you not feel you should resign too?
Today's report makes clear that events at Winterbourne View Hospital followed serious failings in the management procedures of Castlebeck Care Limited. My priority has been to ensure we implement change to make sure this can never happen again.
No one, it seems, was willing to properly investigate the allegations of abuse. The report says the council relied too heavily on the police, and the police too much on the NHS.
It's quite apparent in the serious case review that there's learning for all agencies, and that's why we've been so keen to be involved in this process of understanding where our failings might have been and what we can do to put that right.
This mother was one of the many who feels the worries she raised about her daughter's care were ignored.
We've just been let down because we have been split up as a family. We haven't been able to have that family unit that we'd like to have. And nobody actually seems to be watching what's going on in these places. Most of the things that go wrong, it is people like myself, parents that go into them, that are saying to the commissioning teams, this is happening, did you know?
Winterbourne View is now closed, but questions it prompted continue to be debated. Matthew Hill, BBC Points West, Bristol.
Well, the whole thing has been shocking. So how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, and is action being taken?
Today's serious case review makes a number of recommendations for all the agencies involved in looking after vulnerable people. Dickon Hooper's been looking through them.
Institutional abuse that no one prevented. To stop it happening again, families involved are clear what they want.
Support for their relatives in their localities. They want empathic and mature staff. They want to be regarded as partners. And most crucially, they want the money that was being paid for their relatives to be in hospital to be transferred to their localities.
The government today promised more local input, but many go further and want these large institutions closed for good.
That type of service is predisposed to risks of abuse and neglect. So if you start with individuals, you ensure that you effectively listen to people and their families who, we heard in Winterbourne View, were not being listened to and were being marginalised. You design the services around the individuals, and then you put in place really effective and robust monitoring.
There was no robust monitoring here, and the head of the Safeguarding Board says no one organisation can lead that process. The authorities, though, had their chances when the whistleblower came forward. So what would he like to see happen now?
Places need to be smaller. That needs to change now. So whether the lead comes from commissioners, central government, it doesn't matter. It's got to come from somewhere. Somebody's got to start doing this. Nothing's working up to now. We've all known this for 20 years, but nothing seems to be, there's no political group that seems to be strong enough to actually stand up and say, we'll make these changes. The changes that are needed are cheaper than Winterbourne View, so there's no financial reason for them not to do it.
The government's report is expected in autumn. Many are hoping for some serious changes. Dickon Hooper, BBC Points West.
Well, today the government said the failings at Winterbourne View should never be repeated, and that the Primary Care Trust, who are responsible for placing people in care, had acted recklessly. This is a failure at every level, and people don't want to see yet another report, yet another load of recommendations and nothing really changing. We have to make sure
that this never happens again. This was shocking. The stories, the pictures of abuse will have shocked everybody, and it's been a very distressing time for the families as well. What is very clear is that it needs action at all sorts of levels to make sure we don't see this happening again.
Well, joining us now is one of the authors of today's report. That's Dr. Gabriel Scally, who recently resigned from the NHS over the government's reforms. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. I mean, I think a lot of viewers will be listening to this and thinking, you know, procedures tightened up, this must never happen again, blah, blah, blah. What's actually going to change, or is it just these rather vague words?
Well, something has to change, no doubt about it. I think at the bottom of it, we've got to remember that what took place was really criminal activity, and happily the people who are responsible, actually responsible for harming those patients and abusing those patients, have been convicted, which is a good thing. The problem is it shouldn't have happened. And secondly, even when it started, there were plenty of opportunities to intervene and stop it, and it didn't. And the two reports published today, the safeguarding report, the adult social care report, and the report in the NHS commissioning, lay out exactly what went wrong there.
Okay, well, the people who've been accused, they'll have their day in court and they'll be able to put their points to the judge. But some people might say, well, this was because we were buying things on the cheap. We were doing things on the cheap, but it wasn't. It was £3,500 per patient per week. Winterbourne View was making a profit of £3.5 million. Why on earth were the people writing these huge cheques not more concerned about where public money went?
Well, there were 14 different primary care trusts who paid those bills, and some local authorities as well. And the patients came from 3 different regions of England, and that's one of the problems. This wasn't a local facility serving a local population. And I think the report issued by MenCap today and the position taken by MenCap is quite clear that these should be local facilities where you can have active involvement.
But we were paying for a Rolls-Royce service and we were getting a rubbish service.
And one of the problems, David, was that the contracts that were placed contained nothing in them, for the most part, about quality or what care should be provided to the patients. They were purely financial, and that was absolutely wrong. If we're going to be commissioning services like this, we need to commission high-quality service. We need to follow up and make sure patients are getting those services, and we need to involve the patients themselves and their carers and their parents in assessing that care on an ongoing, continuous basis.
Okay, well, the whole thing's been very surprising and very shocking, hasn't it? Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Thank you.
A damning report says disabled patients at Winterbourne View care home were failed by regulators, police, social services and the NHS. But could it all happen again? Now, they were meant to be looked after and protected, but instead the disabled patients at Winterbourne View care home were pinned to the ground by staff, trapped under chairs and even poked in the eye. Today, an official inquiry said residents had been let down by regulators, police, social services and the NHS itself. But as Jane Death reports, charities are warning tonight that the scandal could even happen again.
Pinned down, tortured with ice-cold water, taunted. The abuse people suffered at Winterbourne View was sickening, secretly filmed by the BBC's Panorama. Yesterday, Michael Oniyema Ezenagu, here on the right, was the latest of 11 ex-members of staff to admit offences against patients. They'll be sentenced later.
But how were they able to get away with these crimes, with the daily, arbitrary violence and abuse? And how much did the authorities know? Well, today we found out.
Castlebeck Care Limited placed adults with learning disabilities and autism under the supervision of poorly paid and untrained staff.
The independent report says out of sight, out of mind commissioning meant the hospital wasn't scrutinised. But it's emerged there were warning signs about Winterbourne View going back years. There were 38 alerts raised with South Gloucestershire Council. There were 29 calls to police. Of 9 incidents of assault, 1 member of staff was prosecuted. Patients made 76 trips to A&E, something the report said should have looked suspicious. It was the old story of agencies not sharing information and social workers too timid to investigate.
I think one of the weaknesses that was found was that social workers were over-deferential to a police perspective. They didn't differentiate between a police threshold and, if you like, their own threshold for considering whether patients are safe or not.
But these social workers are professionals, trained professionals. Where was their professional scepticism?
I agree.
It fell to a whistleblower nurse to try to stop the abuse. But the regulator, the Care Quality Commission, didn't bother to ring him back. A serious error of judgment, it says.
We made too many assumptions and took too much reassurance from the provider, Castlebeck, and too much assurance that other parts of the system were taking forward the whistleblowing information.
Light touch regulation failed. And today, disability charity MenCap warned it could happen again. They've had hundreds of reports of abuse and neglect from families with loved ones in care.
Far too many people are being sent far too far away from home to large units, a bit like Winterbourne, where they're away from their families, and the evidence shows there's much greater risk of neglect and abuse.
Castlebeck Care says increased training in its other centres means abuse will never happen again. The patients who were hurt and humiliated here are safe now, but their families say they're still traumatised. Jane Death, Channel 4 News, Bristol.